Good evening, everyone. My name is Bryce Carter. I really appreciate the warm welcome and the sleuthing you've done online to find my story. Yes, I grew up in Northern Virginia, and definitely it's been a wild journey. Like you were saying, I did a lot of advocacy work at Virginia Tech. I did work with the Sierra Club, so I ran a Beyond Coal campaign, transitioned to Our Wild America, did public lands work, and then worked with Ready for 100, which was the best way I can summarize it, a movement to commitments around 100% renewable electricity and then really energy, which is where Colorado is today. How do we get to a fully net zero state economy? Now, I'll talk more about that, but again, it's been such a wild ride. And again, such a delight to be here tonight. I am the program manager for geothermal with the Colorado Energy Office. And tonight I'm going to talk about the heat beneath our feet and talk about geothermal. This is intended to be a little bit of a 101 conversation and cover some of the basics, help you get caught up with what's happening, tell the Colorado story. So that's who I am. I'm in the Strategic Initiatives and Finance team, Sci-Fi. It is a little intentional and fun to be on that team. And with the Colorado Energy Office, we are a subset of the governor's office, and our mission is to really help reduce greenhouse gas emissions and consumer energy costs, helping advance clean energy efficiency and zero emission vehicles. Our vision really is how do we support and move toward a prosperous clean energy future for Colorado, understanding there's a ton of economic, environmental, and community benefits that come from that future. So tonight I'm going to talk about geothermal energy, talk about what we know as traditional geothermal energy. So a lot of you know about steam turbines and you see the water plumes and all that. We'll talk about that, where it's come from and where it's going with enhanced and advanced geothermal systems. Talk about reservoirs and thermal energy networks, and then talk about the context for Colorado. Where are we? What does this mean for our future? Some case studies, some projects that we're going to be funding in our funding in Colorado, as well as what this means in the context of state and federal incentives. We help try to get the market lift off. And this is something I try to incorporate in presentations I give. You know, as we especially have dialogues, we want to make sure everyone feels inclusive and feel like everyone is present. So as we get into questions, we just like to cover, let's stay on topic, actively listen. Want to make sure we hear different opinions if there are in the room. And also as we think about, who's here, we always want to acknowledge if there's harm seen or experienced, because we never know who is the next leader in the geothermal industry. And so this is just something, again, I like to always include, because as we think about equity, this is a big part of how do we paint and pave the way to a renewable energy future. But for a lot of folks, this is what we think of for geothermal energy. You think about the steam plume, you have some pipes coming out of the ground, it's like magic, it turns turbines, and that's what we know. And a lot has changed since then. I'm going to remember this picture, and I'll circle back to that in a few minutes here. But I'm going to start with lower temperature geothermal in terms of what applications it has. When I say lower temperature, I'm talking about maybe 55 degrees Fahrenheit, maybe 100 degrees, somewhere in that range. And what's important to know is there's a magic of heat pumps. And heat pumps, if you think about your refrigerator, it's you open the door, you have that cold air, but you also have the hot air at your feet. What's happening is there's a heat pump in your refrigerator that basically is condensing out the heat, and it's pumping it out, and that's how your refrigerator cools down. Same thing with an air conditioner is essentially a one-way heat pump. The heat pump has a valve that lets you reverse it, and you can have it large enough for your house. So in the summertime, you're pumping heat out of your house. In the wintertime, you're pumping your heat from outside in. And what blew my mind when I first started learning about geothermal is, even if it's really cold, like this weekend at negative 10 degrees is what we're going to experience, there's still heat in that air. And so your heat pump is going to have to work a lot harder, but it can actually pull that heat out and heat your home. In fact, I have an air source heat pump, and our boiler went out. We used to have a baseboard system. So I'm full air source heat pump, going to go through negative 10 degrees, and I'll let you know how it goes. And I'm not that worried. So yeah, that's more or less about heat pumps, and that's important to understand what it means when we talk about ground source heat pumps. So air source, you're pulling from that air, and what happens is a really hot day, it's 100 degrees, 120 degrees, whatever heat we get, that heat pump has to work much harder to get to the right temperature. Same thing if it's really cold, it has to work a lot harder to exchange that heat. The beauty of ground source heat pumps is that the ground's a constant temperature. Often the ground is around here, probably around 55 degrees. And so the idea of a ground source heat pump is that you create loops. And within that loop, I forgot to mention is refrigerant. And that's where, without nerding out too much, there's a phase change in a heat pump. So the refrigerant goes from a liquid to a gas. And that allows, and then in exchange, it creates. And so that's where with the heat pump, instead of exchanging with the air, ground source, so the goal of a ground source heat pump is having as much exchange in the ground as possible to size the system appropriately so you have that heat exchange. And so you can do loop systems close to the surface, or you can drill straight down, talking about 400, 500 feet, and be able to have that exchange that way. And the beauty about a heat pump is they tend to be most efficient at right around 55 degrees. So when you're talking about comparing an air source heat pump versus a ground source heat pump, depending on those temperatures, a ground source heat pump can be 5 times more efficient. So when you're talking about heat exchange, suddenly when you look at the world of heat, your perspective changes because everything is a resource. So heat producers, you think about data centers, factories, hot springs, sewage, oil and gas industry, of course, ice skating rinks. A lot of these places, you have to have giant condensers and you pump the heat out, and that's all you do and think about. But all of that is a resource. And in fact, Denver, the stock show, has one of the largest heat waste recovery systems from the sewage lines in North America. And so the stock show is, I think it's like 80 or 90% covered by Denver sewage, by its heating. Another way I think about this is, you know, we go for a soak in the hot springs. We enjoy that lovely hot temperatures of 100 so degrees. And then that water, what do? We just let it go off into the streams. Imagine if we had a heat exchanger that could balance out a heat system. That's free heat. So a lot of communities are saying, well, wait a second. We could not only have free heat instead of having to pay for propane or gas, but with that heat, maybe we could do some snow melt. So we actually have a lot of mountain towns looking to do exactly that, snow melt, as well as a thermology network and balancing out those demands. I'll talk more about those implications in a minute here. The stories go on, and for examples, but ultimately, you know, we can actually not only use that heat for heating, agriculture, snow melt. There's actually a project in Wyoming. A data center is linking to an agriculture facility. They're just pumping the heat straight in there. But depending on the design of your geo-exchange system, you could have ground loop systems tied with that and help store the heat year round. So that way you can cycle and balance out the system to use that free heat. So remember that picture that I was showing of that water, the steam plume coming out? This is actually the same facility today. And as you can see, there's no plume. They actually have essentially a large radiator system to spin those fans and turbines to generate electricity. And I actually took this photo flying into Reno. And it's also interesting, it's not just those two facilities. You have another one here, and literally across the road is the entire neighborhood. And you don't really hear about people in Nevada complaining too much about their noisy geothermal neighbors. So I think this really highlights the evolution of technology and how it's matured. But conceptually, what we've seen here and around the world is you have the typical geothermal electricity production. You find out, oh, there's hot water boiling out of the ground here. Let's plug into that and make that work. So you have the California geysers, for instance. You can go ahead and drill several production wells, and that's where you can take up that heat, use it to spin turbines, and then you have an injection well, and you can recycle it. And the beauty of it is by recycling it, not only can it help recharge the heat, but also you are able to maintain pressures. So you know, there are concerns about seismicity anytime you're involved in underground, but this actually can help keep stable pressures. So that's geothermal as we know today, and that's the vast majority of the principles around deployment that we've seen of several gigawatts. And I'll show some stats worldwide here. But this is where we get into the cool emerging technologies. And it's called enhanced geothermal systems, or EGS, if you hear that term. And so the concept is, okay, as we get down to bedrock, solid rock, it gets to be really hot. Talking about 200, 300, 500, 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit. And so you can actually flash water with those temperatures. And so what we're seeing is, okay, we can actually start drilling down really deep. And at those temperatures, we're starting to experiment and design technology that lets us not melt equipment. And so there's a project called Forge in Utah, and the photo in the bio is me at this facility where they actually have very high temperatures close to the surface. So school mines and others have been partnered with this project to test out technology, test out modern day equipment, and even microseismic monitoring. And it's amazing. You can see the technology of how they can develop 3D models of exactly where every fracture is being done. But fundamentally, what EGS is about, you have solid hot rock, you go in and you fracture that solid rock. So you create a reservoir out of solid rock. So not hydrocarbons. And a lot of people are like, oh my God, fracking, which I come from Sierra Club, I get it. But this is actually, again, creating a reservoir from solid rock that's super hot. And then you have an injection well and then a production well, bring down that heat. And then you can create essentially a power plant almost anywhere as you start to look at this. And what's exciting about Forge is the next step of that is how do we test this technology at depth? So we're not talking about 5 or 10,000 feet, we're talking about 20,000 feet. And that project is called GLADE, and I forgot the acronym, but it's actually going to be in Weld County. And they're going to be able to test out at 20,000 feet, how does this work for the industry? How do we deploy this? And I know they just got the permits to proceed, so we'll be seeing development for that project this year, which is really exciting to see implications. And there are a lot of companies, one of them is Fervo. There's a lot of new emerging technology around advancing drill bits. And so what's exciting about Fervo is they partner with Google. Some of you may have heard about this. They worked with Google on a data center where they, I believe it was in New Mexico and Nevada, but they drilled down and did this technology and are producing 3 megawatts of electricity for Google, proof of concept. And so as we think about the tens, hundreds of megawatts, thousands of megawatts coming down from data centers, it opens up a new opportunity that's readily accessible today versus potentially some of the other technologies we're hearing about. So that's enhanced geothermal. There's other technologies emerging. Advanced geothermal systems kind of is a lump sum of different technologies. Ever is based in Alberta. They basically say, okay, we can still get to these depths, but instead of fracturing and creating a reservoir, we can basically create a series of pipes, radiator, essentially. And they've done a pilot in Germany where they're producing heat for an entire city, and they're beginning to experiment with that. And they actually won an award from the state of Colorado with CU Boulder. And they're looking at CU Boulder not only to use geothermal heat for their heating and cooling on 3 of their 4 campuses, but they're also looking at, oh, could we produce electricity on our campus as well? And so there are studies that we're funding to explore that. Ever is going to be part of that, looking at seeing if this technology can apply in that circumstance. And where we're not that successful going down the road, we're starting to see more and more emerging opportunities like that. And I'll have some maps I'll talk about of how these technologies and where how they're being applied and looked at in Colorado. Another technology is Sage Geosystems. They basically are looking at the opportunities of geothermal and saying, you know what? We have a heat resource. We can also work with pressure and actually create a battery. And so when there is cheap pricing, or even in some cases net negative pricing, which I think we'll see in the years to come in the United States, we can turn on compressors and be able to have mechanical storage and in these high heat reservoirs create pressure. And so suddenly you have a 17-hour battery where at peak production times, you just release that pressure, turn turbines, you're producing electricity. And we actually have a project that's been awarded funds in Steamboat Springs to do this right on the ski slope, figure out not only production of electricity, but also using that waste heat to do snow melt in a thermal energy network and hydrogen production. So, you know, I'll be continuing to mention a bunch of these projects. Are they going to pan out as we are working to support funding and everything? Maybe, maybe not. But again, it's just heat. And so there's a lot of opportunity, I think, in a lot of scenarios that we can continue to explore. Another one is we have tens of thousands of oil and gas wells in Colorado. A lot of them we know have really hot temperatures, especially Denver-Julesburg Basin, which is, from Denver up to Weld County. And so there is a lot of looking into, can we actually produce electricity with existing boreholes? So obviously we need to check the structural integrity. And there is some looking into abandoned wells, which is a big problem in Colorado and often comes on to taxpayers to help fill them. But can we incentivize the market to say, hey, here's a well with a little bit of work, it's structurally sound, it can create heat. So there's a couple projects being talked about. One of them is in Pierce, Colorado. They have a series of underproducing wells. And so they're looking to repurpose them for providing a thermal energy network for the town and seeing if they can even do electricity. So that's a little bit of geothermal 101. Again, from that low temperature to high temperature, again, lots of opportunity, but also what does that really mean in the Colorado context? So I'm sure you guys know the guy on the left here. That is Governor Polis. And obviously there's a lot that he has done to support geothermal in Colorado. Part of that is understanding also not only opportunities around decarbonization, but also looking at where we are compared to the world. And first and foremost, this is a little bit of just geothermal around the world. The map on the left is from an NREL study from 2021. I think it's off by a couple hundred megawatts to today, but it's basically telling the story. On the right side, you can see around the world. The US is in the lead, and most of the production, and I haven't looked too much in depth, but everything that you see here is more or less that easy to grab geothermal energy. We see hot water close to the surface. We know where it is. Let's produce it. And California has the geysers. Nevada has lots of resources. And there's a spattering of other opportunities, as you can see, in Oregon, Idaho, New Mexico, et cetera. But of course, Colorado is not even on this map. And it's true. We don't have any geothermal electricity production today. And so what's changed? Why are we suddenly talking about geothermal if it's not even a resource? And that's where Governor Polis really helped kind of see the opportunity of the heat beneath our feet. So as governor and chair of the Western Governors Association, he really wanted to highlight the opportunities geothermal could provide, especially deep geothermal, as this emerging technology, the newest wave of the way the technology is maturing can apply to Colorado. That included not only with this report, but also setting some money aside for grant programs, which actually hired my position 2 years ago. And so they made recommendations that went to the federal government and others to really help figure out how do we move forward with geothermal. And so with that momentum, we think about specifically Colorado. What does that story mean for us? As I mentioned, there is the goal that we have for net zero emissions by 2050. And that includes 80% renewable electricity by 2030, which I kind of looked at the calendar the other day. I'm like, wait, it's 2020. We're in the future now. What is this? But when you think about that's 5 years away, and we're actually on target. I know even some of the more recent data, you see a lot of coal, you see a lot of gas still, but very rapidly we're seeing that transition. Very rapidly we're seeing those retirement dates for facilities. So there is a lot of momentum moving that. But of course, when you're talking about renewable electricity transition, the last 10 to 20% is always the hardest to do. And geothermal is definitely a big opportunity. One reason why is geothermal provides clean, firm electricity, which is different from renewables, which is variable. And people say, oh, well, the wind's not blowing, the sun's not shining. I just want to emphasize the wind's blowing somewhere. It's just a matter of getting it to where it needs to be used. But at the same time, geothermal allows us to make sure we have reliable, high capacity, dependable electricity and is scalable. And so when we're really talking about that last 10%, instead of building gigawatts of batteries, which can be extremely expensive, geothermal is a very promising technology. Additionally, going back to talking about heat pumps, so geothermal energy, when we talk about heating and cooling, I mentioned that ground source heat pumps are about 5 times more efficient than air source heat pumps. That translates not only to money savings for consumers, but utilities love it. Because at the end of the day, they're talking about less power lines that they have to build, less infrastructure to accommodate electrification. It enhances resiliency, reduces peak demand, and all of the while helps keep the lights on. In fact, CK Energy in Oklahoma gave a presentation over the summer, and they basically were incentivizing electrification, realized they were undermining their grid, and decided, oh, wait, if we flip the incentive and pay for people to go geothermal individually, they actually were able to save enough money that they could reduce rates. They're saving about $1.5 million for their rural electric co-op per year. And so again, for utilities, it's a very big promising opportunity. And similarly, it reduces energy burden. Whether there's evolving demand around the world, wars, you name it, you're suddenly not dependent on the external commodity for your local community. The heat's right there, again, beneath your feet. And as I mentioned, there's community resilience, which I think my next slide might cover this, but there is, you think about utilities, you think about rural communities. What does that mean when we talk about extreme weather events? What happens when some power lines might go down? You're not going to lose that heat. It's in the ground. You can still, with some, as long as those heat pumps can still work, you can still exchange that heat and keep the heat going, and then even produce electricity locally, depending on, again, what you design. Additionally, Colorado, this is the latest data I could find. We have over 33,000 miles of gas distribution pipelines. Technically, every mile needs to be decarbonized by 2040. So what does that look like? We have 54,000 workers in the natural gas and oil industry. And I've heard this debated by different people. Regardless of how that's calculated, at the end of the day, we're talking about thousands of jobs that have the same application. The difference is you have a pipe with a blue line instead of a yellow line. So they are the same type of pipes as gas networks. They involve similar workforce skills as we think about this gas distribution system. And we think about deep geothermal, those tens of thousands of feet that we are drilling. That's the exact same technology for the oil and gas industry. And just to emphasize, again, wearing my hat from Sierra Club days, I've had people very concerned saying, well, fracking and earthquakes and all these things. And again, that's always a risk when you're underground. But also, when you think about what we've learned and what's happened in the last 20 years, those mature learnings from the oil and gas industry are now where we start for the latest for geothermal. And so those lessons have been learned. We know how to maintain pressures and avoid overpressurizing a reservoir that can cause higher risk of seismic quakes or whatever it could be. So again, there's a lot that's already been learned, and those skill sets, again, can be applied. And so we're talking fundamentally, these are jobs that are created locally, are long-term careers, keep energy dollars within the community. And even in some cases, I'm hearing from a couple other communities as they're trying to figure out what this looks like. These networks, thermal energy networks, you need people to facilitate these systems. And I'll talk about Colorado State University in a few minutes. They have some really innovative ways of managing the system. We're talking about potentially more jobs being created at reduced cost because, again, you have to regulate where it's going. So I was kind of alluding to this earlier. What's a nightmare for utilities? Right now, think about this weekend. Imagine you're a mountain town and every single Rivian and Tesla Cybertruck and every large-scale battery-powered car comes in and you just electrified, you did the right thing, and everyone plugs in, and then everyone turns on their heat, and then you get that negative 20-degree temperature. That's going to keep you up if you're a utility, right? So when you're thinking, and especially when rural communities, you're at the end of a power line. Like you have one sole source of electricity. So geothermal can not only help produce electricity, it can produce heat, it could do cascading heat, or it could do, again, a thermal energy network. So it really can help address a lot of those concerns within the industry. Okay, so great, this is all great, but what is Colorado actually? What's the potential here? Colorado has the second largest heat flow anomaly in the United States. We have more heat potential here than Yellowstone. And so you can actually see that map. There is, it kind of is cut off, but like Yellowstone has a hot spot. But as you get deeper and you think about the thermal gradient, which is how quickly it gets hotter as you dig deeper, we have at least 2 to 8 gigawatts of electricity capacity. And this is a study from NREL based on anticipated growth within the market, which we are on target, if not accelerating toward. We also, let's see, yeah, I mentioned Glade with 20,000 feet. And also, as we are retiring our coal-fired power plants, we're having gigawatts of transmission capacity opening. And so as we look at this map and think about where that transmission capacity is, lots of opportunities to see where that can all come in. So last year, there was a study released in the summer related to what data do we actually have and what confidence of the data do we have. And what this map shows is where red is, we have a high confidence that there is a hot spot here. So if we dig down, there's going to be heat to the temperatures that we believe for electricity. And then a caveat, I'll say there's the cold spots, which is, yeah, this is not the most economical geothermal. But what we started seeing is, oh, if we dig even deeper with technology, we might be able to get access heat almost anywhere. I'll show a map that shows that. But again, this is showing the data density of what we know. Most of this data is from oil and gas sector. And a lot of this is modeling. So while there is knowledge in certain areas like Weld County, a lot of this is still, there's a lot of unknowns. And if you're a company that says, I want geothermal, but I need to confirm there's a resource, this may not be enough for you to actually move forward with it. We actually need a well in the ground that's producing the heat. We've seen that in Utah, where once they produced a well and they had some production, then leasing rights were sold all around it and then new projects developed. And so that's right where we are in Colorado is, okay, we are 0 kilowatts of capacity, but how do we start looking at this? And then this graph gets me really excited because, as I mentioned, Glade is looking at 20,000 feet. The average oil and gas well is around 7,000 feet in Colorado. So yes, there is a bit of a stretch there. But if we do have the technological demonstration and reduction of costs to get down to 15,000 feet or even 10,000 feet, what this map shows, the green color is saying we can reach temperatures of around 200 to, I think it was 235 degrees Fahrenheit or so. That's like the absolute minimum needed to produce electricity. And that's the green. And so when you start looking at the reds, it's more easier to access that heat. But you can see, depending on the circumstances, most of Colorado, there's opportunities to do geothermal heat. And so I think that's an open question to see how this market evolves. And again, where is that heat going to be demonstrated? But it really highlights, again, the applications and how we want this to work, or what this means in the community context can really vary. So I mentioned Colorado Mesa University, and I'm just going to give a couple quick case studies of this. One emphasis, just to clarify, is Colorado Mesa University, they're using what's called an ambient temperature loop. So they have a big water pipe that's in a loop on campus that's ground temperature, 55 degrees. And every building that they have is interconnected with that water pipe. And what they found with the 1.2 million square feet that they've networked with this thermal energy network, and they have thousands of heat pumps tied into this system. I don't have that number, thousands. They were able to not only be extremely efficient, but they were, as I mentioned, a ground source heat pump on a standalone is about 5 times more efficient. In the wintertime, they were nearly 9 times more efficient. And just a quick aside, coefficient of performance, what that means is you think about your gas furnace, maybe it's super efficient, 95% efficient. A heat pump uses existing heat, so actually is 100% plus. So an air source heat pump can be 200 to 300 to 400% more efficient than your furnace. We just talk about energy as a whole. This is 8.9. So compared to gas, we're using energy 9 times more efficiently through this system. It was so efficient, they didn't even need to turn a boiler last winter. So, and then the numbers, it's reduced demand, it's energy savings, which reduces their bills, it's reduced natural gas, saving water, and they reduce tuition. That's just one campus. Imagine what we could do elsewhere. And then this project may or may not move forward, but this study, I think, explains a lot. So for those that have been following Brown Ranch, it's just west of Steamboat Springs. There was an annexation vote that failed. We'll see what happens. But they did an analysis of, okay, we're doing a whole new development, anywhere from 1,000 to 1,800 homes, some mixed-use commercial. And they're like, okay, the graphic here, baseline, the very first column there is business as usual gas. What is the life cycle cost for that? And so there's a little bit of a high upfront cost. You got to do the gas infrastructure, and you can see what that cost is. It's I think it's like 300 million or whatever it says. And then the next one is, okay, what if we do electrification? Okay, everyone's going to have a heat pump, their air source heat pump, at least for the development and for the people that live there. Yeah, it's a less of a upfront cost, but the energy cost is about the same over the lifetime because it's you're still using electricity. But then the last one is, what if we did a thermal energy network? And not only can you see the life cycle cost is reduced by $100 million because guess what? You're again using the battery of the ground, that thermal potential, being able to capitalize on the efficiency of the system. And while there is a higher upfront cost, with incentives, which I'll just say right now, there's a lot of favorable discussions around federal incentives in geothermal. Who knows where we're going to be even a week from now? But as of now, they exist. And if they continue to exist for that community, which is an energy community, which means it has coal transition, as well as if they pay for prevailing wages with labor and use American-made products, it can actually cover about 50% of the cost, upfront cost of that system. And so that has it, which makes it competitive. It makes it a no-brainer. And so again, this is just a case study, but there are communities of thousands of homes all across Colorado that are having this conversation right now. Do we need gas? What do we do from here? So to wrap up in the next couple of minutes, I'm just going to quickly talk about some of the incentives that are out there. My official emphasis is I can't give tax advice. Don't ask me. But what you can see here is for the IRA, there's two incentives. There's residential, 30%. So if you do a ground source heat pump at your house, you can get 30% back, similar to solar. And then there's an investment tax credit, so commercial. And it's a little more complicated. You have a base rate. And as I was just mentioning a second ago, then you have a bonus if you provide prevailing wage and apprenticeship requirements. And then if you do domestic content, which these are pipes, this is oil and gas. This is what they know how to do. This is American made. You get a 10% bonus. And then if you're in an energy community, you get an additional bonus as well. And where are those energy communities? You can see a lot of them in the Western Slope. There's actually a surprising couple different ones in Denver, Metro, and Boulder. I believe either all of Golden or maybe just north of Golden also qualifies, which is fascinating to me. And I think that was related to the Coors facility that they had. So, so again, depending on the circumstances, and talk to your tax advisor, if you're doing a thermal energy network, you can get half off today in this region. Check the map, et cetera. But again, anyone that's looking at this, huge economic opportunity. So as we're looking at Pueblo power plants, and this is a little ironic, downtown Craig is a white spot. They actually don't have energy community status. But just outside Craig, they do. And yet half of downtown Boulder does. So anyway, that said, it's a really good resource. Then Colorado, when I was hired, they said, okay, we want to mirror what we see federally. How do we move the market in Colorado? How do we make ourselves a leader? And so I was assigned to basically look at what's the groundwork we have and where do we go? So as I mentioned, we have our initiatives. So legislation's been passed to support greenhouse gas reductions, moving toward a net zero economy. We also passed clean heat framework. And what that says is, hey, gas utilities, one, you have to reduce your emissions. And two, by the way, you can actually run these thermal energy networks. Check that out, probably. And then my program was established running our grant program of $12 million. That was back in 2022. And then what was the Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission was not just rebranded, which people kind of like, oh, they just renamed and it's the same thing. It is fundamentally different in terms of now they're called the Energy and Carbon Management Commission. And they are overseeing geothermal energy and carbon. And they do have principles around like what is the environmental priorities around deployment. And so yes, we still have an oil and gas industry, but the fact that they do incorporate those values as part of the reviews and certainly see the opportunities around geothermal, it's a really innovative and exciting transition as that office continues to grow. And then lastly, there's a bill that was passed last year I guess 2 years now, regarding allowing, again, emphasizing that creating that thermal energy networks, and actually requires Xcel Energy to deploy several pilots related to thermal energy networks, and that's underway now. So we do have incentives in play. These are, the top part is merit-based incentives. So you can apply competitively, and then you essentially will get a tax credit reservation. And so we have our own geothermal electricity investment tax credit. That's 30% investment tax credit, and we, the CEO, can give a bonus of up to 50%, up to $5 million. What that means is if you have, and then the same thing applies to thermal energy networks. So if you have an electricity project or a thermal energy network that's $10 million in an energy community, and you get that $5 million from the feds, and we award $5 million from the state, you build it for free. Good deal. Additionally, we do have a very competitive production tax credit for geothermal electricity at 2 cents per kilowatt hour. The federal rate is 2.4 cents per kilowatt hour. We, again, have currently no production. That's going to evolve every year as we hopefully see adoption. Again, these are very good incentives, and I can tell you they are working. A lot of people are knocking down the door and figuring out how do we get in Colorado. And then additionally, we do have a heat pump tax credit, and these rates are basically flat rates for residential, and then there's increments of 4 tons for non-residential buildings. So for every 4 tons, is a credit for ground source, $3,000. Caveat is, in fact, actually, the next slide says this. It is run by installers, actually. We certify installers to administer that tax credit. They actually can retain up to 2/3 of that themselves if they would like, to help administer it. And part of that is to incentivize the industry. I was asked earlier tonight, what's going on, what are the big challenges and roadblocks that we're seeing for adoption. One of them is the workforce. You can make a lot more money in oil and gas than geothermal, and there's not a lot of incentives really for even HVAC contractors to jump into the geothermal world. There's our incentive. For every $3,000 for a residential unit, they can keep $2,000 right now. And that's going to evolve over time, where more and more is going to go to the consumer, but it's really intended to help jumpstart the industry. And we're still evaluating how effective that is and what that looks like over time. But we are trying to be innovative with how do we move the industry forward. And then now I can see what I may have forgotten, but we do have a lot of projects that we have awarded across the state. So what you can see here is everything in yellow is a single structure geothermal project. So we have 3 fire stations in Pueblo. We have the Denver Nature and Science Museum. We have a few projects kind of going into the central part of the state. But we also have a lot of community district heating grants or thermal energy networks. You can see they're really all over the state. And in fact, between a recent Xcel Energy filing where they said, who's interested in this, and our own inquiries that we've been seeing, I've counted about 70 communities in Colorado that are looking at thermal energy networks right now. So the movement's here. It's really exciting. They're all trying to figure out, how do we do this? And that's part of where I think we in my work, is trying to figure out how do we facilitate this in the best way and get the information that's needed. So we did award $7.7 million of awards back in May 2024. And we just closed our second round for the grant program just 2 weeks ago. So it's been a busy time. And we also have a tax credit program for both our electricity and thermal energy networks. And that's open every 6 months. So that just closed as well. So to wrap up, this is a presentation we had around labor and a conversation with the governor and others to talk about what are those intersections as we look at the opportunities, what are the questions we should be asking the workforce, and how do we begin to monitor what's happening, and how do we support it? And if nothing else, how do we connect the people that are trying to figure this out on their own with each other to make this more efficient and for the benefit of Colorado? And so conversations like tonight are really important to be part of this new emerging market. So I, again, just want to say thank you so much for your time tonight. And with that, I will conclude and I'm happy to answer questions.
So thank you. I realize this is an emerging technology. So if you set aside the financial incentives, how cost competitive are these deep drill geothermal plants, 20,000 plus feet, which is a stretch for the oil and gas industry, How cost competitive without the incentives are these plants versus solar, wind, or nuclear, which are also clean energy competitors?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I know your mic was off for the first half, but again, to emphasize, it's what is the cost competitive where technology is today compared to other resources without incentives? And the answer is they're not. And that's where we are seeing rapidly. Well, let me back up. The federal government and the Geothermal Technology Office has created a GeoShot initiative specifically to reduce the cost of deep geothermal drilling and technology. And their projections are okay, by 2040, we believe we can get down to $45 a megawatt hour. If I need to double check if it was 24 or 20, but basically that's the goal. The project with Fervo and Google is accelerating that timeline. And it's still too early to know for sure when that cost competitive intersection is going to be. But I think one of the other elements is this isn't a one-for-one comparison to renewable energy. Because it's a clean, firm technology and you have that baseload potential, and comparing that to coal, nuclear, gas, the value proposition of geothermal goes up. And that's before you then say, oh, we have this heat. Down the street is an industrial facility or maybe a community. Suddenly you have cascading use that could also be applied as part of that heat. So there is a little bit of a different evolution of thinking of what is that value chain tied to the cost of geothermal. So again, what we're seeing is the costs are coming down, but one of the highest costs and highest risk for the industry right now is where is that heat for us to access? And so a lot of our incentives that we've given out is to figure out, can we do test wells across Colorado to find that heat, provide that demonstration, and then I think we'll start to see more investments, which will continue to reduce the cost.
Our next question's up front.
I think I'm still in kindergarten. You drill down, and then don't you have to send water down to get the heat to come up? And does that come up in a different pipe?
Yeah, so yes, there's a couple different applications of how it can be done. So typically, the original technology was you have hot water, you put in a hole and you produce it, and then you release it in steam, which is unsustainable because you're going to just keep releasing water and depleting the reservoir. Now the industry re-injects that water, heat the pressure, and the heat, there's so much heat in the ground. I know there's some projects where you only have lost a couple degrees Fahrenheit of temperature over decades. Not to say like each reservoir is going to be a different characteristic, but it can be just a reservoir in the ground. So it's just groundwater that they're cycling through. There are companies like Ever that have a closed loop system. It could be water, it could be like glycol. There's a couple different liquids that are being looked at, but generally not really toxic things. And then cycling it through to collect that heat and then bring it up. And so, yes, it's allowing that, you need that injection well and that production well. And then what's in between the two could be, again, an open reservoir, could be a closed reservoir, or you can create a reservoir of solid rock. So again, you can create high pressure and actually fracture. And in those fractures, that's where you can create a reservoir of solid rock. Does that answer your question? Yeah.
We've got a question in the center, and then we'll come over here to the far side.
So this is more of a comment and maybe kind of a question too. But downtown Denver, Xcel Energy provides steam and cool water. They have a big refrigeration plant on 15th Street.
I've toured it. Yeah.
And a steam plant, and it seems like it would lend itself so well to converting to thermal, that already there. And I just like your comments on that.
Yeah, I think absolutely. I think metropolitan areas that have any type of steam system, any type of cooling system, and for those that don't know, with the pipe system in downtown Denver, they literally have a building where they basically freeze water overnight and then thaw it, and they pump that water through, really cold water through buildings to help cool them down during the summer. So within that infrastructure, absolutely, when it ages, what's next? And I know Denver is looking at the question, and many other metropolitan areas are too. And one thing I actually forgot to mention is there is a challenge in Denver and elsewhere, is there are new rules and regulations around wastewater heat. And the wastewater facility for Denver needs to reject 150 megawatts thermal of heat. And so that means they have to do a bunch of condensing towers, try to figure out how to meet environmental regulations. Maybe they could be captured, used. It's maybe an idea to explore. So, but the answer is yes.
Hi, thank you for being here, Bryce. This is
Of course.
excellent. So, would you say that geothermal has an advantage over wind and solar when you're considering wildlife and land
Wildlife and what was the
use?
second?
Land use.
Land use, yes. So, like any technology, there will be impact. And I think it's worth acknowledging that. I think when we talk about geothermal technologies, the land impact will be similar to oil and gas well, but you're not going to generally have emissions. I've had our friends from NREL say, don't say never emissions because sometimes it can happen, but generally these are closed loop systems. And at least for our basins in Colorado, that's not necessarily an issue. But that said, certainly part of all of this is the regulatory process. And so for any well, anywhere, it needs to go through rigorous analysis of wildlife impacts, land impacts, community involvement, and conversation. And so, my background's community organizing. That's a vital part of all of this. So I would say, impact-wise, once the facility is up and running, it's fairly minimal. Lights off. There's all sorts of mitigation that can happen, and community benefit agreements as well as they design the project. So certainly, just like wind turbines, they work really well. But if you place them in a migratory path, you can have challenges. And I think what the majority of land use is really what's underground, which will have minimal impact on the surface as long as it's all done responsibly, which is casing, protecting groundwater, et cetera.
Thank you. The map that you showed that Craig, the town of Craig wasn't in it and around it was, those were for incentives or the heat map?
Yes, thank you for the question because that's a good clarification. So those were incentives, and that was the federal definitions of energy communities. And that definition, I know there's lots of caveats, I think, but it's basically, I think it's census tract. Within a census tract of a coal plant retirement or adjacent census tract. And it just so happens with the Craig power plant, downtown Craig didn't meet that criteria. And I know I've heard from multiple representatives, they've pushed back, but it is what it is, unfortunately.
What countries in the world are really advanced in this technology?
Yeah, that's actually a really good question because as you saw with the graphic, there is deployment geothermal. And when we talk about enhanced geothermal systems and we talk about advanced geothermal systems, it really is the United States. And we've had conversations with Iceland. We have a memorandum of understanding with Alberta. There is trying to be shared learning as we see this emerging technology. But the investments from the Geothermal Technology Office and the federal side, especially this GeoShot initiative, it really has been the United States leadership. Colorado stands out, and I've been learning this from my role. New England, they've been piloting thermal energy networks and trying to figure out how do we do this. New York, Massachusetts, and a few others, Vermont, they've been pushing policies which we've replicated on the network side. And for anyone that loves podcasts, there's a podcast called Volts, and a colleague out of Massachusetts just was interviewed, I think, first about the Framingham project, which is a thermal energy network that just is online and it's being piloted. Lots of good information in that. Then on the geothermal deep side, you have Nevada and California, which is generally, again, that hydrothermal resources. You have projects like Fervo, which is one of the first that's doing enhanced geothermal systems. But this is all relatively new. I know companies like Sage Geosystems, that project in Steamboat Springs that uses the pressure, they're just now piloting projects on military bases that are going operational in the coming months. So while there has been demonstration of technology here and there, the market viability of this is only now being demonstrated. It's being demonstrated in the country because of our incentives. A lot of them are saying, okay, great, let's see the opportunities here. So very much as much as we can be a resource, we want to network with other countries to figure out what we learn, how do we learn from them. And I know it's projects like in Germany with Ever where they're doing that work, but I don't know a lot of enhanced geothermal systems internationally.
We have another question here in the center.
Yeah, you won't be blamed for killing birds or whales, but get ready for the ground squirrels and prairie dogs is coming.
Certainly.
Yeah, I'm curious. The many thousands of abandoned oil wells. What is the reality when their average is 7,000, not 20,000? What is the reality of bringing those online and utilizing them rather than plugging them?
The answer is it depends on the circumstances, of course. So I think if it's in the Denver-Julesburg Basin, we are seeing a lot of opportunity where we know there's hot water or at least hot fluids from those wells. And so there is opportunities to utilize that. But is there an off-taker nearby? A lot of these wells are out many miles from any other infrastructure. So what that means is there really isn't a place to plug that in. It could relate to a electricity generation, but is a transmission nearby? You have to build that out. And so I think that's the economic question that's coming out between what's currently available in the market to repurpose these wells versus what the future could hold for incentivizing them. We do have incentives to plug wells because obviously we need any emissions are coming from open wells we need to resolve. This allows for a market opportunity for that to happen within the market without taxpayer dollars. So I have talked to communities that are trying to figure out what's next for them. A lot of communities that say, well, we get severance funds from oil and gas. At the same time, oil and gas is getting depleted. What's next? I load up a Google map and the entire town is surrounded by wells that are underproducing. Like, hey, you have a resource right here. So your question is how many? If we're talking about thermal energy networks, again, you come down to 55 degrees that can work. But when you start talking about 100 degrees or even higher, it just means that the system has to work less hard during the wintertime. And so it all comes down to calculating that thermal load and how to balance that system based on what you have. And I forgot to mention one of my favorite facts about Colorado Mesa University. Their system, because as they continue to add new buildings, it sometimes gets out of balance. And so they've been doing really creative things like their irrigation system. They actually have heat exchangers. So at nighttime when they have to irrigate all the fields, they use hot water from their system to cool the system down. If it's going to be water you use anyway, might as well just plug it in. There's other technologies that look at instead of a full bore field, you have a bunch of wells that you can balance out a system, which I just found out yesterday. The Denver Federal Center is going to build a thermal energy network, and I think they're going to have 2,880 wells. So think of all that linear feet to get all that heat exchange. But you could design a system to hold higher temperature heat, run more efficiently. And then again, that's the beauty of this is you just think about heat. I even had one company that wanted to repurpose a basement of a large warehouse that is not going to be used. Like, can we fill it with water and make it a thermal storage? Hypothetically, yes, but you should talk to the Department of Water Resources. So, but yeah, again, it's really comes down to the opportunities. And, I think part of our learning with this emerging market is where are those gaps? If we find there's a bunch of wells, but maybe not a transmission line, but there's a high heat opportunity, maybe there's some push or support that we could use to build infrastructure there. And again, that's, I think, what we're eager to see what happens in the market and where the needs are.
You mentioned severance taxes a few times in terms of payments for oil and gas development. Is there any kind of structure that's in place right now for compensating anybody for the heat resources? Is there some way that communities or individuals could benefit from heat resources underneath their properties?
Yeah, so geothermal in Colorado is classified as a surface right. So if you have surface access, you can access that heat. I would always caution, we don't necessarily want to determine a value of heat, because that value is relative for every circumstance, every thermal energy network. I won't go into the legalese. It gets very complicated, but there's definitely some opportunities and questions there. I lost my train of thought. Yeah, royalties type of thing. Yeah. So there are federal royalties. I actually just saw the last couple of days, Idaho and Utah are looking at federal selling of leases for geothermal resources. I'm not aware of anything happening in Colorado right now, but certainly that can be negotiated depending how that heat's going to be used and what's negotiated. And it's also worth thinking about, the value proposition of electrons and versus heat, and who is your end user. So if you are trying to interconnect with the electric grid, again, the value proposition is going to look differently than if you're going to have offsetting heat. And if you're a rural community that's stuck on propane, that cost proposition is going to be very different than, say, natural gas even. So the answer is it's complicated, and I think that's part of what we're going to see at the market as it evolves.
Could you please address within the United States and also internationally, what are the cultural differences in perspective for the use of geothermal?
Certainly. I know NREL has done work in Hawaii and other locations where there has been concern about geothermal development. And in the case of Hawaii, there's a cultural belief for certain communities that the volcanoes and lava that essentially is their mother. And so they see geothermal as, oh, you are stealing from our mother. And so there is some very sensitive dialogues to reflect on that and what that means for those communities. And certainly I think there's different cultural interpretations as well as concerns. I think I believe it was a community in Germany where a project was being pursued, and it was kind of not intentionally hush hush, but just industrial development outside of town. No one really paid attention. They didn't do a lot of outreach. There was a microquake. Everyone freaked out, and the project was shut down pretty quickly. So I think very much it's about engaging and meeting community where they're at, actively listening to different perspectives, understanding and respecting those perspectives, and having those conversations even before projects on the table. That type of transformational work is going to ensure that these projects are successful while also respecting local communities. And even where all things may not be seen eye to eye, at least you can have a better understanding and inclusive approach. And it's as a community organizer in my past, it's not always easy to do. It's actually really hard work, as leaders and facilitators of events will understand. But again, I think it's really important to understand that local context. And I know, we've seen that even Burning Man, if you saw that last year, they stopped a geothermal power plant because they were protesting for potential implications.
And one more on this side when that
Okay.
So it sounds like a lot of these projects are trying to make a very large demonstration of geothermal's capabilities. And I'm wondering, how far are we away from simpler ways to use geothermal in households, standard products that maybe manufacturers are coming up with that builders can spec and use and architects see?
I will, yeah. And that's a great question. So the question is, we're seeing a lot of these large scale projects. We're seeing a lot of emerging technologies. How is this going to apply really on that local home context? What are we seeing coming out of that right now? Thermal energy networks, again, is one element of this, of interconnecting buildings, and especially new neighborhoods, there's opportunities. For individual homes, there are companies in Colorado today you can call up and go ahead and have them drill 2 holes in your yard, get 400, 500 feet, and have a geothermal heat pump system. One of the challenges we have, and one of those bottlenecks, is we have only, I think, 6 or 7 companies certified in the entire state to do that drilling. And so there is a need to expand that market. We are aware of companies coming to Colorado, and some of those companies, again, are looking at likely thousands of projects very soon. On the more emerging side, as I've been to conferences, I know some of the energy labs, they're looking at the concept of, we talked about Denver, and they have their cooling building, basically a smaller version of that for a household where you could essentially have a reverse water heater. You can ice it up or maybe just below freezing temperature or glycol, having really low temperature, and use that as a heat sink instead of using the ground. I'm curious to see where those technologies go. Hypothetically, you could just have a giant tank. And in fact, I know one of the folks that moved forward with this work in New England saw that, like, wait a second, I have a sewer line right here. I could just connect every house on my block to this. And the sewer company is like, whoa, we're going to get cold sewage coming to us. But there is a lot of emerging conversations about what that looks like and making it more accessible. And again, thinking about heat. And the challenge for homeowners is drilling in your yard. One, obviously there's a hassle there, but also that does cost money. It costs significant upfront money. Of course, once the pipes are in, they're good for 50 to 100 years. But again, the payoff is not necessarily there for individual homes. And so that's one reason why a lot of folks are looking at utilities. You could, instead of at each home, you could have it in the middle of the street, and just along the street have those boreholes interconnect the homes and balance out the system. There is a project in Austin, Texas called Whisper Valley, where they did a hybrid approach. Each house has one well with the house, and then they're all interconnected in the thermal energy network. And so I think we're going to continue to see models like that emerge. Okay. Are we all feeling grounded? I feel like I haven't done enough puns tonight. So thank you.